If I could get the first slide, please. Sorry, we had a bit of a technical difficulty. I knew and everyone were the crying out words which cannot be spoken. I knew and everyone were the frozen white froth of words which lie caught in the vines of the lips. If I can have the next. Thank you. Poet, dramatist, journalist H. Leivick. He really doesn't need an introduction, but pen name of Leivick Halpern was born in 1888 in Human near Minsk in what is now Belarus. He initially seemed destined to become a rabbi, but in rather quick succession, he was expelled from yeshiva, formally joined the Bund, who was arrested twice, and the second time sentenced to prison and exile in Siberia. Upon his escape, he set out for New York, where he'd spend most of the 45 years of his career. The best known of his works in, well, any language is probably the Goylem, the Golem, though other plays are frequently revived, and his translators have included such luminaries as Cynthia Ozick. In a passage near the end of his 1957 speech, Der Yid, der Yochid, the Jew, the individual, H. Leivick recalls a single critically formative day in his childhood. On this particular day, he's assaulted for being Jewish, breaks down at the thought of the sacrifice of Isaac, the Akedah, and sticks his tongue to a frozen pole. If I can have the next slide. I put my tongue to the frozen iron. The tip of my tongue sticks to the iron, freezes to it. I pull the tip of my tongue away, and my tongue begins to bleed, filling my mouth with blood. The four occurrences in one day laid a permanent mark upon my entire life and were the undertone of all my later poems and dramas. Sandra Goodhart and Sarah R. Horowitz, who both treated this speech at some length, see within it an unconscious repression of an unspeakable loss, the death of his younger sister, whose shrouded body is even referred to as the silence in a late poem about her loss. They see that as the fourth event, which remains unexplained. But the speech itself also provides a further clue to his own conception of his silences, particularly in the injury of his tongue. Recognized by his colleagues as a poet who, in the words of Abraham Sutzkever, had sworn so long to sing of the muteness of the word, Leivick himself says that his difficulty in speaking comes from his father. And Horowitz, in fact, sees the injury as a metaphorical circumcision and inherently male. But Leivick himself specifically notes his silence as coming from someone he views as more grievously repressed, even amongst the oppressed Jews of Tsarist Russia. My mother gave me silent lips and searching hands, he writes in Clouds Behind the Forest, and father stammers his words, therefore mother keeps entirely silent in Ballad of the Desert. While his father might be repressed, the silence seems to be a maternal inheritance and perhaps even an allegiance. Another significant personal silence is that of his years in prison. The tongue, he notes in Osiris Katorga, is the last thing left to the prisoner. Leivick, by his own account, has even that power removed when he silenced at his trial. So muteness in Leivick's text seems to start as a manifestation of all these psychic and physical wounds, perhaps even beginning in the fact that he can't bring himself to explain the true reason for his injury to his parents. There's just too many causes, including his not infrequent physical and verbal abuse at the hands of his father. He's just too frightened to tell the truth. Throughout Leivick's work, this injury of the tongue is continually reenacted in imagery of dysfunctional language, words that fail, which cannot be articulated or even forced out, throats are often strangled. There are frequent repetitions which seem both refrain and stammer. Sometimes we ourselves, humanity, are in fact called the crying out of unspoken words. If I can have the next slide, please. But these are silences which Leivick rejects in some way. It's their breaking, such as in these excerpts, with singing in the prison or punctuating the silence with crying, laughter, or shaking one's chains. It's this breaking rather than their existence, which is sacred or elevated beyond the mundane. Silence can actually be very dangerous in his personal symbology. It's the worst of all imaginable punishments. For example, der Rav and der Wolf, who eventually becomes a werewolf, can't pray or even scream, and thus winds up losing his humanity almost entirely. To counter this effect, Leivick sometimes inverts history, in fact. Some characters which are based on people who in real life were largely speechless are actually given extensive voice in his work. But there are other silences, though, that Leivick exalts. Silence and solitude are a critical part in his processing of an experience, he tells us, and he even sometimes suggests the abolition of literature, the word, the act of writing, just too uncomfortable to him. As he says, it sometimes seems to me that even the finest poem, the most direct cry and song, the most direct prayer, needs to cast off the guise of the word, the chain of sound. If I can get the next slide. There's also frequent reference in Leivick's work to a last word, which remains unrevealed and unspoken. Sometimes it's implied to be a name or a farewell, but its power and its significance are largely in its absence. In A Hard Neck and Nothing More, which I've got excerpted here, it's intentionally unrecorded, leaving only bones as mute, terrifying witness to some unknown catastrophe. Here, sound is a punishment and a burden to be carried, and silence is presented as a means for discovery of pure, if terrible, truth. And what emerges from this aspect of Leivick's treatment of silence are a few significant silences, speechless characters, and personas in his work, their presence often signposting the otherworldly or the sacred. Now, Leivick's work is often concerned with the creation of, if I can borrow Rosemary Garland Thompson's term, the extraordinary body, but in a twofold sense. It creates a body outside of societal norm and one that is sanctified and or superhuman, the one leading to the other. Oppressed bodies are more admirable, sublime ones in his conception, and he is, quote, more envious of the martyr than the hero. This isn't with the intent of voyeurism or spectacle that he does this, but out of deep empathy and sympathy. These silences too are grounded in the self, seemingly in this childhood injury of his. If we return to that day when Leivick stuck his tongue to the frozen pole in light of his work, we can see how he plays a game of what if. A punch in the head from an anti-Semite becomes a pogrom. The angel is a moment too late to save all of Isaac, leaving him scarred. And a very specific, kindly, personal, extraordinary body is created by Leivick's magnifying and heightening his bleeding tongue into an entirely absent one. And he makes the wounded, disabled, or othered body a conduit through which the power of the divine may be channeled or enacted. His madmen know more, his blind men see more, and those who can't speak are the ones to give prophecy. He situates his personal, extraordinary body and its silence within his own recurrent motifs, as well as within the framework of Jewish law and tradition. For example, the most moral of all the denizens of his 1923 play, Poor Kingdom, is perhaps a deaf man who's part of an army of beggars, managed as a business by Melech, who's faking his own disability. The deaf man is first judged as, quote, something not quite entirely like us. As directly speculated in the text that the silent man may be one of the Lamed Vavniks, the hidden holy people, according to tradition, upon whom the continued existence of the world is predicated, and with whom Leivick is frequently preoccupied. Just a warning here, as I ask for the next slide. Leivick's language around disability is very much of its time and highly problematic. So as we can see here, we have the mute. He's only really known in the text as deaf mute, who is taking action against Melech, the faker, the charlatan. And his son Chaim is the one who accuses the deaf man of being a Lamed Vavnik. It's interesting, it comes as an accusation, but Kingdom speechless character is more than Lamed Bavnik, though, and he's arguably the instrument of the divine. He is, you know, he acts as the hand of God almost in the play. It is him that drags Melech to his ultimate fate, to ride the cart that he's been using to fake in reality. The extraordinary body is one that's often put at odds with Judaism, and Leivick is frequently, if not always, constrained by the limits of halacha, scripture, and tradition. According to Jewish law, someone who is deaf and unable to speak Beferish might not be treated as a fully responsible adult in the eyes of the law. So how can the deaf mute, as I said, the only name he's given in the text, be a metaphorical presence of God if he doesn't count? But Leivick seems to tread very, very carefully here. As the character is introduced, we learn in the stage directions that all is not exactly what it may seem. Sometimes he reacts as though he has heard, hinted as possessing some form of hearing, which allows this mute prophecy a standing within Jewish law. He comprehends, therefore, it's allowed. And this appears to be Leivick's loophole to give divine power to the physically and socially oppressed, and reconcile it with his own aims, reconcile his own aims with the constraints of the Jewish framework in which he habitually operates. If I could get the next slide. We see a similar figure a decade later in 1932's Redemption comedy. It's the sequel to Der Goylem. Here, it's the prophet Elijah who's rendered silent, his tongue having been removed by the Moshiach ben Yosef, the last force actively standing in the way of the true Moshiach, Hanina, that's him in the picture, redemption of the world. If I can get the next slide, please. There is a bit of a discussion as to what has happened. We've established that his tongue is gone and he's unable to speak, but he is also still able to tell Hanina what is going to happen. He confirms that his fate must be blood. There's a heightening again and an inversion whereby the blind and now speechless Elijah is made more powerful in his supposed powerlessness. The prophecy which is delivered in and by the silence here is the truest and most terrible yet. The Moshiach must bloody his hands and in that act doom himself, possibly even dooming the redemption for the time being. So how is it that Leivick reconciles lack of speech with prophecy here? Firstly, there's a check for Elijah's comprehension. Then there are two potential textual justifications, one of which is Elijah's own experience in the Tanakh of God's voice not being in the wind, the earthquake, the fire, but in the still small voice or the silence afterwards. And in the by title of the Golem dreams, the Golem perhaps has merely dreamed the actions of the play. As Leivick knows from decade to decade, his speechless figures increase in stature to that which for him is the inevitable, if extreme, conclusion, reaching a climax in 1945's I Was Not in Treblinka bin ich nicht gewesen. The victim in the poet's voice will paradoxically first be heard. If I could have the next slide, please. The victim in the poet's voice will paradoxically first be heard, Leivick posits in the first few poems of the volume, in the post-war silence, the yawning absence of speakers, of unwritten works, unsung songs. But what happens, he then asks, if we continue to remain silent? Then the fires continue to burn, he says, and everything's thrown into it, the victim, the words, the tongue. Even God isn't spared. A few poems later in The Mute, the speaker meets a mangled and brutalized version of God, one who's taken the form of what has happened to both the language and the people, who can only sign, quote, that something dreadful has happened to him. If I can have the next slide. Just as God signed with his mute hands, and I sought in myself a word, a scorching one, and found it, and would have brought it to his lips. Just then, my word too remained hung in the silence. That's the second to last stanza there. Human silence is at least implied. It has brought God to the state and keeps him there. We return, at least in part, to the idea that human silence imposed by some external mortal repression or failing of morality, such as the unrepentant murderers of the Day of Reckoning. If I can have the next slide. This is one of his post-war ones after the visit he made to the DP camps in Germany. To ensure the return of divine speech, God and man must, to reference yet another poem of the same post-war period, touch each other's lips with fire, as in Isaiah, to prepare for further prophecy and to make each other whole. Post-World War II, and particularly post the Stalinist purges of 1937 and 1952, Leivick's last word or words, that concept, returns, and their absence and lackings is more profound than previously. They may be consumed by flame or entire stanzas torn away from the page to leave only a hole. It's in these later years, in an essay for Zumkunft in 1956, that I think we find a very clear possibility of what Leivick's ultimately unsayable last word is. If I can have the next slide, please. Latterly, Leivick continues to move to the conceptually extreme, but he's paring the words away, refining until rather than thousands of words, we're left but with a single one, which rather than being important by its absence, is absence by its significance, by reason of its holiness, rather than by a personal reticence, oppression, failing, or injury. And it seems it might well be the ineffable, unutterable name of God, a God whose voice he awaits hearing again, whose commandments he awaits being reinscribed upon him. If I can have the next. All the words of all tongues, Leivick tells us, lead the true artist to their source, to the solitary word, which signifies the solitary name. There is, in truth, no more than one word. If I could have the, and then last one. So, Asherim Dank.